An original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
It is indeed. Welcome in. All the cheering throng just waiting anxiously for this week's edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Okay, settle in. We're here. Dave Trafford here with John Wright from Republic Opinion. And Keith Leslie joining us from Antigonish, Nova Scotia, where, you know, you're more present in the local media now than you've ever been, I think, since you moved to Nova Scotia.
I know.
Local media, I mean, here in the middle of the universe. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you know, Toronto, Hamilton, Windsor, I still do quite a bit of local media. And as you say, what we call local media, even though I've been in Nova Scotia. And that's when I moved here during COVID, that's one thing that one of the, side benefits of COVID was you were able to do this kind of thing from anywhere and stay as in touch and watch every news conference and everything else I needed to watch to stay on top of things. So it's made doing it from here relatively easy, although I do make sure I come to Toronto at least a few times a year and get into Queen's Park, and I'll be there next week.
Yeah, well, geez, I look at the calendar, and we're only, just getting back into the rhythm at Queen's Park after the long Christmas break, and they're off again next week for their constituency. Who plans that calendar?
Basically, the government sets itself, the maximum vacation and downtime as they can for the legislature itself, really. So when they see any week that's got a possible holiday, of course, it's March break week, so they're not going to sit during that week. Any week that has a holiday Monday, basically that's going to be a constituency week as well. The government sets it, and the government sets it to its own advantage, of course. And then again, they get to change the hours. In December, they'll say, okay, we need to sit to midnight every night to get it done, then we're adjourning a week early. So it's all basically done on the government's agenda.
Yeah, well, I think there was one year, it might have been in the Ray years, but somebody counted up the number of days they actually sat in the legislature, and it was fewer than 50. I mean, it was crazy. So, did they get anything done? I don't know. But needless to say, even when they're in or they're out, there's stuff to talk about. A few things that we want to loop back on, and we didn't get to it last week because I think properly so. We spent most of the episode entirely talking about the legacy of Brian Mulroney. So if you missed that, dip in because there's some, look back to last week's show because there's some interesting insights and personal experiences in terms of covering and watching and observing what kind of impact and legacy Mulroney had, certainly not just on Canadian politics, but international. But the one thing that kind of was bubbling to the surface, and still this week, again, John, was this whole idea of the province appointing judges, and that's what they're supposed to do. The government of the day has that responsibility. But it kind of hit the fan probably about 3 or so weeks ago when it became evident that two people on the committee that's going to select the judges is, sort of the like-minded Ford appointees. And this whole narrative around we want more like-minded judges, that is to the Premier's thinking, and to make sure that we're not soft on crime. And that obviously caught fire in headlines, etc. This week we had a number of former Chief Justices in Ontario saying you can't really politicize the bench. Now, I suppose the Premier can. My own read of this is the justices are right, but this is nothing more than Doug Ford playing to his base in Ontario.
Shocking that governments would appoint people that they know to boards. Isn't that terrible? I mean, you find it. You mustn't find that anywhere else in the country. Not to be sarcastic fully, but I mean, it represents 15% of the vote on a committee. So, I mean, you're right. It does play to the politics and to the anger of today where people want judges to be harder. Governments bring in legislation that says you're going to serve minimum sentences, and that gets struck down, rightly so, because it should be up to the court at the time. I think, however, what catches fire here is two things. Number one is the proximity of the people who are being appointed to the Premier's office. There are lots of other people out there who would have been able to advocate for strong-willed judges and that. And again, I go back to 15% of the people on it are represent what the Premier's appointed. And maybe they could have just said, in the ingredients in baking bread, this is just a pinch of salt. On the other hand, it's, again, close to the Premier's office, but it's also the chair. And there's a sense that the chair has more power. And so I guess I'm a bit betwixt and between here. I think that it's important that if the government wants to have representation on these boards, that they should do so. But the consequence of that with the judicial system is such that the critics will go after them for putting a thumb on the scale of justice that is more political than it's necessary. And that's where you're going to get, legal groups who are saying that it's being politicized. But I don't think that it certainly isn't washing much over the public. It's getting a lot of heat, but it certainly won't, because a lot of the public believe that what the Premier's saying is true, that we have this revolving door around bail and a bunch of other things. So on the one hand, I can understand the outrage that there is for this, and it seems to be that this government, as I said, they could have picked other people, especially somebody from a lobbying firm that's not representing a gun company. On the other hand, I think it reflects the temper of the public that says, yeah, well, we do want this. We don't want the revolving door. So the political side of this is really the critical thing, but the public side, I don't think really matters that much.
Yeah, and the other side of that, Keith, is how we sort of there are two lanes in terms of where the judges fall here in Ontario, for example. Some of the judges are federally appointed. They're still Ontario judges, but they're federally appointed. And then there are provincial court judges who are appointed by the Queen's Park folks. So even there, we're not talking about all the judges in Ontario, and that gets muddied because just the general perception is they're all Ontario judges and they all get appointed by the same source. So to John's point, to get down in the weeds on this and try to explain it in 140 characters is almost impossible.
Well, at first, my first reaction to this was, there goes Doug Ford again saying the quiet part out loud.
Right.
That we all know that past premiers have had some sort of hand in the selection of judges. Same as the federal government has some sort of hand in the appointment of judges. And I thought the PC government's response here in one sense was, well, you've got the Trudeau Liberal government far behind its appointments because it's looking for woke judges. Well, we're looking for judges that aren't going to be woke, that are going to be tough and lock people up and keep them off, in jail instead of granting bail so easily. It's a simple message to get through. I think for a lot of people, that will be the takeaway. Why, as John said, why wouldn't people support the government for trying to crack down, and especially these repeat offenders we're seeing out on bail committing horrendous crimes? People are in favor of this. Governments, though, I think the PC government went a step too far in having, two former premier staffers, one of whom, as John pointed out, is a lobbyist for a gun company, appointed to this board that's going to select the judges, is just too straight up political, even if it's only 15% of the board. And then we had the premier himself, doubling down, tripling down on this and saying, why would I would never appoint a Liberal or an NDP judge. Really? That's not the criteria that we want to see in Ontario. We want to see the best people for the job. Yes, you're going to pick someone that is politically aligned with you to some degree, but we don't want them to be Liberal judges or NDP judges or PC judges. We don't want our court system politicized to that degree because, as the former Superior Court judges pointed out, that undermines everybody's confidence in the system if they think the government is appointing judges that are going to rule, as they do in the United States, very much along political lines. There's another tack to this, which is, of course, we have a government that's still facing an RCMP investigation, now talking about how it's going to appoint like-minded judges. The appearance of all of it is not very good. The optics are terrible in some sense. But someone else, a friend of mine, Mark Cripps, who used to work in the Ministry of Health, pointed out, he said he thinks this is a big distraction by the Ford government. They know that most people don't care about this, and they can do a whole bunch of other things while people are arguing about this, which really doesn't impact that many people overall.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I've got, judges in the family and some friends of the family who are judges, and all due respect to every one of them who sat on the bench, they they knew people who helped them facilitate their appointment. And I'm not saying that there was anything backhanded or backroomed about it, but there's a whole network that goes into this kind of appointment. Certainly. I'm not surprised by that. But to your point, Keith, I don't ever remember anybody having to pass the political litmus test to land a job on the bench. And in fact, those whom I know who sat on the bench or sit on the bench, they wouldn't have tolerated that kind of bullshit if they were being asked that, or it was even considered implicitly. In this case, it's explicitly.
And I think that's the problem. You're explicitly trying to politicize the judiciary, which is going to undermine everyone's confidence in one of the few institutions left that most people do have some confidence in. There's a lot of feeling that too many people are out on bail, but this is a job for the laws to be passed that will toughen this up. So I think this is where the Ford government has a lot of support on this to a certain degree. But to have a big, cry and furor over the Ford government is wanting to appoint like-minded judges, well, as I say, he's saying the quiet part out loud. There's been a whole process, and someone knew someone. It used to be what we called political bagmen that were involved in this sort of thing. And some of these judges perhaps had served in those roles. The point is, when they got to the judiciary, they were no longer a political party affiliate or a partisan in any way. They became neutral and had to stay that way. The government is saying that's what they're going to do here. Once they pass their political litmus test that they're going to be PC like-minded, then they can be neutral when they get to the bench. I don't think it works that way.
Yeah, no, and I just, again, I think that the whole point of this at the end of it all, though, is it speaks to the concerns that the core, the base, may have for the Tories. But other than that, to your point, and I think the observation is clear, yeah, this isn't really playing beyond that.
Yeah, well, I think that if you were to do the polls today and you asked whether or not judges were making the right decisions when it came to people who are accused of or convicted of certain crimes or coming into the courts and issues about bail, you'd find 85% of the public on side with Doug Ford. I think it would. I mean, it's not. People think that it's a revolving door, especially in major urban centers. And so, again, I go back to this and say, what I always find is fascinating. It's almost I don't buy into the comment that your friend made, Keith. That's kind of like it's a distraction that was kind of deliberate. I mean, you get what you have, and this is not great publicity in the sense that you could be talking about other things. Maybe the government doesn't want to talk about housing, or maybe it doesn't want to talk about healthcare and things like that. But I can't see them deliberately setting this up. What I find in a lot of governments, it's true with the federal and provincial, but mainly the provincial, is, it's that phrase that, like Jay Leno used once. It's kind of like, what were you thinking? I mean, there's no kind of third party where, there's at least Brian Mulroney, who we talked about last week, would pick up the phone and call a bunch of people and call not necessarily all the partisans, but call other people and sort of say, what do you think? And it's kind of like, oh, geez, if you want to do it, maybe you should just say it's the ingredients. It's only 2 people out of 13. It's, 15%. It's a small, it's things like that. And maybe you should offset it, put one partisan person that used to work in the premier's office here, but get somebody else who's an advocate, who's a hard writer anyways, and say, hey, it's just balance. That's all we're talking about here. It's the phrasing of this. It's the positioning of it. It's not like-minded. It's not special interest. It's the balance we're looking for. And people would have gone, yeah, okay, I see that. It's the balance, but it's the phraseology of it. And it's, again, I come back to this and say that these are unintended. I think they're unintended falls. I think they think that they're doing the right thing and they're picking the right people and they're doing everything that they think is right. But it's almost like they don't give a phone call to somebody on the outside like you and Annie Ganesh, who would kind of go, all right, if you want to do it, have you thought of this? And maybe you could do that. And maybe if there's an appointment that lasts these many years, you do the next one that's got even a tweak higher on it. But it's the communication stuff on this that always seems to get lost in the decision-making, whether it be the green belt or whether it be this or something else. And I wonder sometimes whether they need more reflection on this from an outside party before they get to a partisan piece. Because again, as I said, I think most people would agree that they think most judges are lenient on these people. in that they would back the government doing it. It's just a matter of the phraseology that I think is difficult.
I think that that's deliberate. I think it's deliberate. I think that they have actually chosen that phraseology deliberately, knowing full well that, the media elite are the ones who are going to get their back up. And those who are opposed to it are going to be, well, then you must be in favor of a revolving door in the courts, and we're going to catch and release and all that kind of stuff. And that plays into the narrative. I can't imagine for a second that there wasn't a 10-minute conversation at least that hinted, if you do this, you're going to catch some shit. I don't believe that didn't happen.
Well, yeah, it may well have been the case. But again, I put it in line with a lot of other decisions that are made by this regime, and they don't seem to be well thought through. I mean, we've talked about them here, where they may sit there and say certain things, but is this a sort of thing that you want to be dealing with when you could be dealing with other things? So as I stated from the outset coming into this podcast, I understand the politics of it. I just think that there are people other than those who served in the premier's office who could have been well suited for this, that wouldn't have drawn the fire that it has and still get the job done. Because at the end of the day, you want to get the job done. And so if you're just...
Well, they've clearly got a goal in mind with the legal system here. I mean, think back to the last little stink, and it was only a very short little stink when they returned with the KC, the King's Council designation for lawyers. Surely that could be a list you could draw your judges for the people you've given KCs to. Wouldn't they be like-minded judges? Because they all went to conservatives. I don't know. I just wonder why this government is. It doesn't seem to matter I think is, as Dave said, that they were warned. Here's going to be the PR backlash, and they don't care. Especially if it's going to be the media and the leftist elite that are going to upset about it. They just don't care, and they think it'll be a short-lived one. Now, whether it will be or not, I think that the judges thing, while they'll get attacked for it overall, I think it'll fade out of the public concern as quickly as the KC designation did.
Well, I wonder what Jamil Giovanni thinks about all this.
Wow.
For those of you
boy, how to make friends.
Just catching up here. He is the guy who won the conservative seat in Durham, the federal by-election. And say what you will about low voter turnout, he is now, the successor to Aaron O'Toole in that riding. And everybody was making a big deal about it. It's been conservative forever, so that he won is not much of a surprise. But, I mean, you were the one that passed the we should talk about this note, John, because holy cow, he came out guns a-blazing, not at the Liberals in Ottawa so much as the Conservatives and the education ministry here in Ontario.
Well, look, I think that the by-election, I got calls from stations and others, reporters that sort of said, in the context of by-elections, does this show anything? And it was kind of like, yeah, well, I mean, you test drive your messages, you do all of those sort of things, and it certainly didn't help the NDP or the Liberals, given the general context. But if Aaron O'Toole had held this and all the others going back, 20-odd years, I mean, you're going to get what you get. I think, however, that what I did say before was that this candidate is a loose cannon, and a loose cannon in that he can turn inwards on you as well as outwards. And what was exercised at the podium may have been said at the door. It may have been all part of this. But you have to be careful because it was a scattergun effect, and it nailed, the Doug Ford administration, which then is a bit of a tripwire because of the way the administration is portrayed to think about Poilievre's, conservatives and poaching a minister and all of that sort of stuff. I just, again, it's that moment where you then say to somebody afterwards, what were you thinking? Like, you won. There was no necessity for this.
But knowing Jamil, and we've all kind of crossed paths with him at some point, that is what he was thinking. We know exactly what he was thinking. That's how he operates.
Right.
But it's still graceless.
Yes.
You don't have to say that out loud. It's just graceless. You just won. You congratulate your team, you take a shot at the Trudeau Liberals or whatever, but to turn around and call the Ontario Education Minister, the PC Education Minister, a Liberal, and it just blatantly attack the Doug Ford government, why? This is not people actually, one of the few things the Doug Ford government gets credit for is working well, playing well with other levels of government. He does a pretty good job of it. and you're going to attack them at this? It just seemed, as I say, graceless and a dumb thing to say on the night you get. It was pointless. There was no need for anyone to say that day.
Well, a graduate from Yale, I mean, is not exactly a right-wing conservative. Look, again,
And we should put out he didn't debate either. Again, he did not debate. Another conservative wouldn't debate in the by-election.
Yeah, conservatives don't do that anymore. They don't show up at debates because they find them meaningless, because they're all stacked decks, and why would you go in a room and get screamed at for that? I get all of that. I think, however, when you look at the individual who's now going to Parliament, I'm not necessarily sure that you're going to get the party discipline on him that you would get on other people. And I think, again, what we saw at the podium the other night is something that, is going to come back again, but maybe point inwards as opposed to pointing outwards. He's very good at communicating, as I said.
Oh, no question.
But as I said, there's a difference between saying stuff at the door when you're doing retail politics and finding the moment afterwards. And I don't think it was the right thing to say.
Well, let me suggest that that the whole point of having him in the Tory caucus in Ottawa is to soften Pierre Poilievre.
Whoa.
Right? I mean, what is that going to do to that caucus when you consider that we're heading? I mean, I realize we're still 18 months away from the federal election and full campaign, but holy cow, I keep looking at this in Ontario. I keep looking at it federally in Ottawa. And as I go down the list of candidates, John, and I don't know that you measure for this or not. I know there are approval ratings and are they getting the job done, et cetera. I just don't like the guy. I just don't like him. Fuck off.
What, like,
I don't know how you measure that in your poll.
No, but you don't like who?
Poilievre. I just think he's a smarmy-ass dink. Period. That's got nothing to do with his politics. He's just back to graceless, to Keith's point. Like, this is the level of discussion and debate that you want to lead this country on? Shut up.
Yeah, I get that. And I understand that. And I think you would say, you could ask questions about the shortcomings of people and in politics. And again, it's if you get 40% of the people in this country who are going to vote for him and they love the way he's taking on Trudeau and the way he speaks, then he'll just keep speaking because you don't need anybody else. Okay, so there is that. You want to open the tent up any further, what are you going to get? Nothing more, because you got all the seats anyways. The issue to me in all of this sort of stuff is how you build bridges. And the problem with the Conservatives as it is now is that they're always fighting the right flank. Yes, there's a tone to Poilievre, and we know the people who are running his office and running his campaign. And we've seen this before. I mean, we saw it at Queen's Park for a period of time when they were involved in doing this stuff. It's like, beat up the media, be nasty, keep people at bay. This is, you're reflecting the anger from the streets, and this is what they want. But at the end of the day, you want to be seen as somebody who is reasonably going to move the country forward by having some bridges to different people. The problem with Poilievre, though, is that he's got 2 or 3 to 4% of the people who are now on side who are just like that, and that it can make the difference in certain ridings. So I oftentimes judge it more of who he's got to court as opposed to who he is. And we always see this thing of it. I mean, political people will often say, run hard from the right and govern from the center left. Maybe that's going to be the case. We've seen that happen so many times, but I think he is nasty. I think we are seeing that constantly because there may be no filter on that right now. And if he gets into power, that's the way it's going to be.
Now, to qualify that, for the sake of balance, I have no more admiration for the Prime Minister either, because I think he is tired. I think the stuff that comes out of his mouth is completely performative. Yeah. There's nothing about that indicates to me, and we sort of touched on that in a backhanded way last week, there's nothing that indicates to me that he was ever ready for the job. And if you recall, that was the slogan of the Harper campaign in 2015. He's not ready. Well, they lost badly, but they weren't wrong.
Yeah, well, it was always about the optics of domestic politics being the day, middle class, women, environment, and all that sort of stuff. Okay. Those issues are still important, but they're not the issues of the day. And secondly, people are tired of him. And that's where Poilievre has, really done a great job, where he's nailed the prime minister on everything. And so his name is attached to everything. The question now is whether or not, so I don't backtrack on this, but I told what I was saying for so long. A lot of my friends are saying he's toast. And it's kind of like, well, let's wait a second. We've got some time here. I mean, he doesn't need 37% for a majority. He's happy with 32%, and that's how he plays this game. So let's see where it goes. As I said a month ago, I think he is toast. I don't think he can recover from this. So the question now becomes, Dave, well, at what point, does he walk away from this, or does he stay in it? I mean, we do have until the following October to kind of do away with what's happening federally, but you've got to have enough time to regenerate. And I don't know whether or not he's going to walk away in enough time to do that, which will leave the door way open for Poilievre to come in and sweep. I mean, he's not near where Brian Mulroney was when he left the stage. But the writing is now deep set when 30% of your own base is going the other way. You can't recover from that. You just can't.
It's clear Justin Trudeau has overstayed his welcome. Going for a fourth term is just pure arrogance, especially when you don't have many accomplishments to back up the desire to give you a fourth term. It's just ridiculous. That said, Pierre Poilievre, there's something of a creep factor that comes with him. I don't know what it is, but he's kind of, whether it's the anger or just the condescension, especially towards journalists. That one where he was eating the apple and putting the guy down, that created such a nasty image, just needlessly condescending. So I don't know. It was funny. There was a bit of a thing again this week. They were trying to make, the Conservatives were trying to make hay out of the fact no one would want to sit down and have a beer with Justin Trudeau. Well, I think a lot more people would want to sit down and have a beer with Justin Trudeau than would with Pierre Poilievre. I really do feel that way. That said, it's his election to lose, it looks like at this point, even though it's 18 months away. So I don't think we're ever going to see that campaign from the right and govern from the center or the center left. There's no left turn in this guy. He's going to stay on the right track and the right side of the road and go further right if necessary. He's not just about campaigning to that base. He's all about making sure that they are happy at all times. And I think that's a big mistake. He's not reaching out to anyone because you say if he can get that 40%, he doesn't need to reach out to more. He needs to reach out to more. Well, yeah, but
again, the only thing I would say is that there's a common denominator in terms of who's managing him. And it was Harper, it was Ford for the first year, and now it's him. And it's always been the same there. It's nasty. It's, the enemy are the media. You get two questions and we're done. There's a noblesse oblige about it all. Like, how dare you be in the face of a leader? There's an anger to the first parts of the terms that these people have. And it's often because of the people that are around you. So I'm being a bit veiled in terms of what I'm saying, but I think you could find a common denominator. If you took a look at all three of those leaders for the campaigning and for the first year in office, you would see it. I mean, remember it was Doug Ford that walked into rooms with people who were told to go from their offices to clap and cheer when he walked into the room, and there was a kind of belt across it so you couldn't cross over. And it was only like, we're gonna say this and then take no questions and walk away. That was stage managed. That was not something that the leader said we're going to do. It was managed that way. And there are consistencies here. So again, they're going to turn and say, look, it's working. Like, look at where we are. 42% in the polls. We just crushed the other guys. Okay, I get that. The question in my mind, though, is can't the Liberals see this now? And can't Trudeau figure this out to say, yeah, I'm going to walk away, in June. And I still have a year, there's still 18 months or 17 months to go until the next leader has to go to the polls. But we've got to rejuvenate. Otherwise, you end up with 20% in the polls, 60 seats, if you're lucky, at the end of the day. And you're burning all of the furniture. Like, it's just like, what are you doing here? So I think the sand is running out in this. But I still think that there's this whole calculus that says we may be nasty, but that's what's out there, and we've got to be nasty. And the reality is it's working for us. I don't know, though, on the history of all of this, whether it's a good game to play.
Well, but we're all running on the assumption, sort of the old playbook, and that was that getting elected was a means to an end. Now getting elected is the end. I mean, I don't see beyond getting elected what the objective for a lot of it. There's no policy, there's no vision, and it doesn't matter who it is. I mean, the same can be said for the Ford government in Ontario. We talked about that several times. All that retail nibble around the edges kind of stuff. I was at the Prospector and Developers Association of Canada conference here in Toronto. It's the largest mining conference in the world. And it was here in Toronto this week. And there's all kinds of money, there's all kinds of activity and so on. And we were in the Northern Ontario Pavilion. We were doing podcasting there with Story Studio Network. And that's where mining lives in this province, Northern Ontario. Now, Vic Fideli dropped by, sat down. We had a good chat about what was going on, and he made some veiled comments about what could and couldn't happen in the Ring of Fire, and we'll get to that in a second. The Premier was there. Do you think he made an appearance in the Northern Ontario Pavilion where all the Northern Ontario miners were gathered? Nope. He was down in the South Building where all the money guys are. So, again, you sort of look at John, back to the deliberate movement of, what are we doing on purpose? And that's where he showed up. Now, admittedly, there was an Ontario, booth in that part of the building, and it's a huge conference area. I understand that. But practically speaking, if he was that interested in what was going on in mining and that committed to all the great work being done, and they generate a lot of money for the province, wouldn't he have shown up there? So, I mean, that's what I mean. There's no long-term view in terms of where we're going with this stuff.
Well, but it's either a question of whether it's deliberate so that he can walk out and say, what's the net value of all of this? So you walk out, whether you went to the Northern Pavilion or whether you went to see the money guys. I mean, you could just walk out and still say, we're here investing and trying to make sure that there's investments in Ontario and blah, 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 blah. The reality is that people want to see the Premier. They want to see that he's taking an interest in where they are across the province and things like that. And so I say, well, is it really deliberate that he stuck to the certain floor and then left because the car was out the front? It could have gone around the back at that convention center. Or is it a blind spot? And I'm going to err on the side of blind spot. I think that there's something here where, even when they tamp down on the unions increases in their pay, that they're now forking out $4 to $5 billion over to cover what they did. I mean, that seemed to be deliberate, sure, at the time, and in anger and the consequences that it's had. But there's no other balance there to kind of say, what are you thinking? Like, have you really thought this through? And to your point, it's more of incremental politics, like at the moment, as opposed to thinking through where you go from this. So, again, I don't think it's necessarily something that is deliberately looked at and said, we're going to just do this. I think there's a blind spot here.
Maybe, but I think just in terms of that gathering, the biggest announcement that came out of it was, the idea that the province has come to terms with Martin Falls and the Wewakwe in the Ring of Fire, and that these nations have signed on to, push the road through in the Ring of Fire, et cetera. In the meantime, there's a news conference, Keith, going on at Queen's Park with one of the other nations saying, hold on, we want an injunction because you didn't talk to us about this. It was all emails and pro form bullshit that they had to tick boxes. There was no conversation with the elders or with the chiefs in those nations. So, to say, but we respect that level of communication and consultation, clearly they do not. And again, that was deliberate. They wanted to push this through so they could make a half-baked announcement about the Ring of Fire at this mining conference.
They failed completely in their duty to consult all the First Nations and to get most of them on side with this. I'm beginning to think that the access road to the Ring of Fire, let alone ever developing the Ring of Fire, that the access road to the Ring of Fire is going to be the next high-speed rail in Canada. We're going to study it for another 20 years, but we're never going to actually achieve it because there are no agreements. As you say, they made one agreement or agreement with a couple of the major First Nations, but there's something like 13 or 14 First Nations that have to be involved in this consultation, in this process. And some of them are absolutely opposed to this. And they're opposed to all kinds of the way this government is allowing staking mining claims on their territories without any registration. There's all sorts of issues, and they're going to keep some First Nations, for sure, offside with this Ring of Fire development until these issues get dealt with, other side issues, if you will. So we're never going to see this development. We know it's there. We know it's so good for so many First Nations. But without this access road, they're still going to have a whole bunch of communities that are flying communities only and surviving on diesel fuel generators. They're not on the hydro. This Ring of Fire, the access road, could bring so much to so many, and yet it's bogged down in politics, and especially with their complete failure to really consult and get the First Nations on side and make sure that they were going to get involved in not only the resource development, but in the jobs and in the prosperity that is supposed to come with it.
Well, the other side of this is the environmental impact. And, of course, they're kind of blowing through the environmental assessment. And now, to some degree, they have put that into the hands of the First Nations and the tribal councils. And that's probably a good place to start the environmental assessment. But here's the problem with that has not yet been addressed as far as I know. The whole thing is those are peat bogs. That's what we're talking about. The whole area is peat, right? And that peat stores billions of tons of carbon. And as soon as we put a road in there, we disrupt the peat. Guess what happens? The carbon is emitted into the atmosphere. They start digging, the carbon is emitted into the atmosphere. Where all the mines are, it's estimated there are 2 billion, like 2 gigatons of carbon stored. To disrupt that would be tied, I will say, for the number one carbon emitter in Canada. The number one emitter last year was our forest fires. 3 times the amount of carbon emitted by fossil fuels, smokestacks, exhaust pipes. And we're all focused on that. If we go in there and just say, to hell with it, we're going to bring the bulldozers in and build the road, and I'm not against the idea. I understand why we need it. But I don't hear any conversation that's really substantive and substantial of how are we going to do this without destroying the atmosphere. Like, this could be the number one polluter in the country. And right now, it's crazy. That should have been top of mind. And this is how we're going to protect the climate. This is how we're going to ensure that the peat stays intact. How are we going to do that? And those conversations have been going on a long time, but never at that political level where it makes any kind of sense. So, I'm sorry, I'm on a rant. But that sort of stuff, to me, has to be top of mind. We're talking about a climate crisis, an existential crisis right now that we're only going to add to just so we can dig mineral out of the ground for EV and EV manufacturers and say that that's good for the environment. Like, the whole message is fucked up. There's no thought going into any of that. We're not closing the circle here. So anyway, I say that because this is at the heart, to me, of what's going on. If you ask them about EVs, they're better for the environment. We're getting rid of fossil fuels. Terrific. We're going to kick out more emissions by building a road in there, never mind mining in there, than we would if we had 3 times as many cars on the road.
Well, and we have to remember, EVs are going to be heavier vehicles. They're going to do more damage on roads. We're going to need more roads repaired more often. They require heavier rubber. We're going to need much more rubber produced to keep the EVs going. The environmental side of all of this electrification of the vehicle system and getting access to it is just ignored. And this government in particular is exempting itself from as much of the environmental regulations and rules as they can, especially with their Highway 413. But this as well, they want to just bypass as much as they can and get her done, as Dougie says. And he's vowed to get on the bulldozer himself to start that ring of road fire. There is zero thought being given to Dave's talking about all the carbon stored in the peat. It's just not on their radar. And it's going to be on somebody's radar at some point. But a lot of the First Nations are raising these very points. They do not want their lands destroyed, their habitat destroyed, so that we can dig out some resources.
Well, I wonder, the mining minister was on hand for the announcement. Makes sense. Where was the environment minister? Where? Shouldn't that have been part on, by the way, here's what we're doing to make sure that the environment is taken care of, that we're not going to poison the water in the, what are the rivers, is the Albany and the Attawapiskat rivers that the road's going to cross. Yeah. And anything upstream. I mean, there's all kinds of study and reporting done on this that's getting ignored. And there's lots of questions. But there's willful ignorance in approaching an answer that makes sense. And I don't think we should be tolerating that. Period. But it's not us. It's way up at Hudson Bay. It's far enough away that nobody's really going to pay attention. And shit, we need the stuff. We need the lithium. Okay, well, I guess it's over. I've left you speechless. Sorry, John.
Well, no, I think the premier is on to, he said for a long time, we've got minerals, we should mine them and put them here and there and all that sort of stuff. I guess the issue that I have in all of this right now is when you say, where's the environment minister? No one can name the environment minister and no one cares. That's kind of it. We've had, I was talking to somebody the other day and I did a lot of research. I did the first research there was with, the first environmental issue that we had in this country pretty much at the time when the environment was becoming an issue was around McDonald's and the clamshells, that the polystyrene clamshells. And the issue that we found at that time, that was 1991, 92, when I did the first studies on the environment in this country, where that people really wanted to have an impact. And that's why the blue boxes were formed. People actually felt that they were contributing something to doing something about the environment. And they would walk to the end of their driveway and they put a blue box down. It was full of stuff, said, I'm doing my bit. And beyond that, there was the Polystyrene Association created on the backs of the McDonald's people who were funding it, and the province did all of that sort of stuff, and people felt pretty good about it until the next issue came around, which was really about Toronto and where it was going to put its garbage. And it was on the road and it was taking it back and forth to the United States and dumping it and stuff like that. And then, we get to all the more complex issues in the environment nowadays. And what people's attitude is look, I can, and we can do as much as we want, but those smokestacks in China just overrate everything that we do. So what's the point? I can understand that. Where the environment plays a role nowadays is just locally. People are beyond this, what can you do in order to change the environment overall for the world so that we can all live in a greener world? And it's become cynical because they don't have any control over it. And secondly, these are decisions that are made globally out of their hands. And oftentimes
test that line, John, when people are choking on the fires from Nova Scotia next summer here in Southern Ontario.
I understand all of that. But at its core, people will say that, yes, it's global warming which is causing this. The majority will say that, but they'll also say, is there anything that we can do about it? And the answer is no. And oftentimes it's because other players who are bigger get away with doing it. And secondly, they've heard it all the time that we can make an impact and it doesn't happen. It's almost a little bit here. I'll put it in this context. Patrick Brown was saying that, he's got real financial problems because the Fed money hasn't come through. They were owed, I think it was $7 million it was announced in November that he's going to get $7 million to look after the immigration issues in his own backyard. And he's standing up going, hey, where's the money? And this is the problem with cynical politics, because it gets announced over and over and over and over again, and it never arrives to do the job that it's supposed to do. When you go back to the environment issue, I say that people care very much about this, but it's out of their hands. They really don't have a blue box. They don't really, they understand carbon taxing and things like that. Well,
that's my point. It's like saying to people that you can save the environment by installing a heat pump. Well, bullshit. That's not the answer. That's a small drop in the bucket. The point is that we need government at all levels that are going to commit to the vision. And we go back to Brian Mulroney last week. They fixed acid rain. They turned that around. They didn't kill our lakes. And at the time, they said, oh, you could never do that. Well, guess what? They did it.
I have a note here, acid rain. I was waiting to jump in with the acid rain comment when John about the environment. Absolutely. It was, they're trying to use it now as acid rain was a false scare, just like climate change, as the people on the far right. No. Acid rain was dealt with. There's parts of Queen's Park is made of limestone. It was just literally crumbling. All these curlicues on the end of a banister were just flat, smooth, right out to now. The building itself, all sorts of buildings. Acid rain was a real issue, and it was dealt with. So there is things that can be done, but it's at the point now, John pointed, like all the things in China that are going, all the other things. What can we do? And we're seeing a lot as well where recycling programs, people are seeing now that it's all being, recycling isn't working. It's all being thrown back into the same garbage bin now because they can't sell the paper, they can't sell the plastics, they can't separate. There's no real market for most of the recycling, and people are becoming very, very cynical about all of this stuff. They do their best, they did their bit, blue bin, gray bin, green bin, brown bin. We're just separating into everything we possibly can, and it's all getting tossed into the same truck or going to the garbage dump. So I think there's a lot of cynicism that's come about because of this, but people at their core still care about the environment, especially climate change and the impact it's having with the extreme weather. We're seeing it everywhere. I mean, it's just absolutely having an impact, and people are concerned, and they need governments to act, not restaurants to impose a carbon fee that they're just going to charge for whatever reason. It's just ludicrous. People are they're rightly upset about carbon taxes, carbon fees when you see governments fighting about this issue. We need unanimity. We need agreed cause. And the Ontario government, I mean, they shut down the cap and trade system, which didn't cost any taxpayer anything. It was very good, actually. It was working really well. And now we had the carbon tax because they canceled that. Why? Pure politics.
Yeah, but again, the question is really how much outrage are you going to address? I mean, people are really concerned about the environment. It's not going to get you any. And this is the problem that I have with all the polling that's done that basically says what's the most important issue facing the country today, and you get 36% who will say it's affordability, followed then by healthcare, followed then by this and this, and the Defense Department's right down at the bottom saying military spending, and they go, there, see. We shouldn't be spending anything on the military, which means that we don't have anything to send, and we don't, over to the Ukraine or to do that sort of stuff. And it's always like it's not on the priority. Yes, it is. It is a priority if you slice it and dice it. The real issue is that you've got provincial and federal governments who can only do so much and to address it. This government is trying to address politically the housing issue and affordability. You even have the Premier saying this week to the Bank of Canada, again, for the third time, drop those interest rates,
That's
tear
just
down
bullshit
this
too.
wall.
That's not his lane. I mean, oh my God.
I know, but it plays great, but that's the point I'm trying to make. It plays great politics. It's not going to have an impact whatsoever on all of this. So it's all smoke and mirrors. But it's about the affordability issue. The more important issues, here's the question for you. Which would you rather have the government addressing? Long-term care or the environment? Okay, put that in the...
You can do both.
But the meat and potatoes of this is that neither are being addressed.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
So
there are no balls in the air here. No.
And one is incredibly predictable. I've been saying this for a decade now. Just go to Stats Canada's website and take a look at the demographics, and there's the train. It's just getting closer to the station every freaking day.
Lights getting brighter.
You can see it, but the issue that we have is that governments select the issues that they're going to deal with, or make decisions in the House to say, we're not going to allow you to have unanimous consent to say a few things about International Women's Day. I mean, those are peas on the plate when you look for a full meal, and the full meal is not being addressed.
Well, we'll see how they push the peas around on the plate. We got the word that they're going to have their budget on Tuesday, March the 26th, so there'll be, I'm sure, a whole lot of crying and screaming and yelling and gnashing of teeth between now and then. Anyway, we've, I just think that the whole question and issue around priority, vision, and that's where, I don't care what level of government we're at, that's what's sorely missing right now. And, there's a fatigue that kicks in, and people just get to your point, John, I'm tired of it. I just do whatever the hell you want. I'm busy over here trying to live my life. But that should be the role of government.
Have a great weekend.
Indeed. Yeah.
Really? It's good. Thanks for that, Phil. That was a church.
It's ready
politics,
to go. Here we Yes, that'll do it for us. That is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.